Larian Studios are running on high right now on an amazing, well-deserved success of Baldur's Gate 3, but it's not their first great game. Divinity Original Sin 2 hit the town in 2017 and was an amazing CRPG in its own right, and today we're going to put both of these CRPGs in the boxing ring to see which one comes out on top. Let's go! So as with all of these video game versus videos, we're going to compare 5 critical elements of these games, and for each category I will pick a winner to see who wins at the end. Let me know your winner down in the comments below, but I'll also mention that this video isn't going to be as strict of a versus as our other ones. We're still going to do a comparison, we're still going to look at both games, but we're not going to be ranking them in the same way because I low-key think that Baldur's Gate 3 just default wins, but I will tell you why and explain why as we progress through this video. So we'll start with technical design, which is our graphics, performance, and bugs umbrella. Now, starting with Divinity Original Sin 2, I personally can't actually talk about how buggy this game was at launch because I didn't play Divinity Original Sin at launch, and it's only fair that we compare the launch sort of bugs / performance for both of these games. And it's interesting to think about that both these games went through an early access period of different lengths and how that has helped their development throughout. In both of these titles, just basing on looking up the research, especially for Divinity Original Sin 2, was the first act of the game was pretty bug-free for the most part because of that early access period, and then once that full release actually happens, Act 2 and Act 3 is where you see those bugs and some of those issues start to crop up. So it's interesting that all of that aspect is actually reflected in Baldur's Gate 3, in that Act 1 is very, very polished, like only a few bugs sort of here and there, and then as you progress into Act 2, some of the cracks start to show, and then into Act 3, definitely more of those cracks start to show with some weird dialogue issues and some things that not necessarily working the way they are supposed to, or events triggering correctly. But overall, for both of these titles, graphically and performance-wise, they both perform extremely well and look incredible. Like, I think that the detail in Divinity Original Sin 2 at the time for a CRPG was really good, and that's always something that I've struggled with personally for CRPGs, is that top-down view not engaging me visually and struggling to sort of interact with the world and immerse myself with the world in that way. And the graphical fidelity in both of the Divinity Original Sin games, but especially in 2, definitely helps with that. For, I guess, someone like me that likes things to look pretty, I guess I'm just vain, but I like my games to look good. And you know, conversely with Baldur's Gate 3, the presentation is just taken to another extreme level. Like, graphically, fidelity just while walking through the world and stuff is incredible. Plus the diversity in the different landscapes. Like, you start in that general, you know, Act 1 area that's sort of, you know, the beach and a little bit of forest here and there, and then you can go down to the Underdark and get the different color palette and saturation that's down there. Then as you go into Act 2, you get a very gloomy, dark aspect from the Shadow-Cursed lands, and then you progress into Act 3 and having just the city be its own unique sort of setup there. But we'll probably touch on it more later as well, but the presentation in Baldur's Gate 3 is just taken to another level. Like, the insane amount of detail in the animations as well as the mocap is just on another level, and really Baldur's Gate 3 into another stratosphere, especially bringing it to different markets that typical CRPG players wouldn't maybe play, because in DOS2 you're always in that top-down view, and instead of having those sort of intricate animations and mocap, they rely on the voice actor to present that to you via like him sort of explaining what the characters are actually acting out and doing, whereas in Baldur's Gate 3 that actually happens in front of you, and I find that that's much more easier to engage with in those dialogue scenes. So obviously Baldur's Gate 3 wins this category. So moving on to story as our category number 2. Now in DOS2, the player character, a sorcerer, is captured by the Divine Order and sent to an island prison known as Fort Joy. On the way there, you're attacked by the Voidwoken, the ship sinks, but somehow, as with always in these games, the player character survives, and from there it's up to you to decide your fate. And essentially that's a core element of both of these games, is that you survive a encounter that most people probably would have died, and you then find your companions and your party, and you sort of progress through the world how you see fit from there. So it is hard to discuss sort of those story choices and where that goes, because it's different for everyone, because you make different choices and you may like or dislike those choices unless you're safe scumming. But in DOS2, I didn't connect with the companions or the origin characters just as my party members as much as I felt that were that sort of connective tissue in Baldur's Gate 3. In DOS2, they do more feel to me personally like they are just companions rather than being their own sort of characters and having their own wants and needs and that sort of a thing. Whereas if you do pick them as an origin character, then you can sort of progress that obviously onto them, which is something you can do in both of these games with their origin characters. But conversely, in Baldur's Gate 3, you end up being abducted by the Mind Flayers onto a Nautiloid. You get a little nice friend inserted into your eye for safekeeping, and then the ship goes down and you somehow survive again. And then from there, you take a very similar start. I mean, you even start on a beach in both of these games, but it's definitely a different experience from there. But it's just interesting how similar the start of these games are. In terms of comparison wise, I think that Baldur's Gate 3 is easier to follow and seems to be deeper with its overall branching paths and choices. I remember one scene at the top of Moonrise Tower where a particular character had like a superhero type entrance, like, you know, superhero landing sort of thing, and it was beautifully animated and very cinematic, and like the music built up for it. And part of me was thinking at the time while watching this, like, damn, you know, imagine how many players made a completely different choice with this particular NPC, and then they won't get this like epic Moonrise Tower specific moment, or even at Moonrise Tower for this specific moment, because you don't have to be, right? Like, that choice and the different way that you sort of take the game is really dependent on your own actions. And Larian have done an incredible job of allowing you to go on your own journey rather than having the game take you on that journey. And it's not all perfect though. I think in terms of the story, there has been discussions on the Reddit and obviously around about a lot of the cut content, especially in Act 3, like certain elements of the city and some of the origin story, character arcs and other arcs that have been cut from the game. And that is definitely noticeable once you sort of get to Act 3. I was honestly a little let down by some of the things that happen in Act 3 because the game really builds up Baldur's Gate. You know, it's called Baldur's Gate 3, but throughout the whole game, everyone's like, we'll see you in Baldur's Gate. Can't wait to get to Baldur's Gate. We're going to get to Baldur's Gate. And then you get to the end of Act 2, you see the city for the first time and you're like, here we go. And then you sort of, those layers peel back a little bit, and it just doesn't, personally for me, it just didn't live up to everything that I was expecting it to be and that Larian had talked about before release in their panels from hell and everything. But it is still a great time and there is still a lot of fun to be had in the city. I just feel like it needed like that little bit extra to really be truly something special when you get to the ending of the game. But that's neither here nor there. It's still an incredible time. So for story, Baldur's Gate 3 wins again in my mind. Moving on to combat. In DOS2, the combat is a sort of traditional turn-based CRPG, sort of a system with their own unique spin on things. Something that's really unique to DOS2 and Larian Studios in general is the environmental effects. Like in DOS2, they are especially like on steroids in terms of the different way that all the different elements interact with each other in these environments. And I actually prefer the spell and combat interactions that you have in DOS2, as I think it's more freeing without the Dungeons and Dragons constraints. And the same goes for those elemental effects and how they can sort of interact with each other. And also in DOS2, you have an action point system rather than like action, bonus action, reaction. You can use those actions to do multiple things per turn. I also am a fan of the mage armor and the physical armor. It's a really cool idea and I actually sort of dig it. So every creature, including you guys as your party, have mage armor and physical armor, and every attack does magic or physical damage, and you break down those armor stats to then deal health damage to the target. And I think that this is a really cool system. It's really unique and it gives you more freedom because of the environmental effects and having the action points to allow you to do multiple things per turn. And I actually like how that all comes together as a whole. And comparatively to Baldur's Gate 3, it's probably the closest tabletop Dungeons and Dragons experience that we've ever gotten in terms of a combat experience. And how I mentioned earlier about, you know, you've got your actions, your bonus actions, and your reactions, and most classes, you know, other than some exceptions, right? But most classes will only have those action, bonus action, reaction that they can essentially do per turn, which in some cases leaves you with essentially just attacking twice, like if you're a martial class and, you know, maybe chugging a potion or something, which in some regards is a bit restrictive in a video game format where just, you know, as a video game player, you sort of want to do lots of things and you want to feel powerful, and you definitely can feel powerful if you build out your characters in the right way. But in some aspects, you are missing that element, I think, because of the Dungeons and Dragons restrictions. But with Larian making tweaks to some of the classes. They are definitely more engaging to play in a video game format, so I think they've done a good job of striking that balance. And something that really stands out in Baldur's Gate 3 is the combat encounter designs, especially some of the boss mechanics and boss fights. I probably won't show any here because I don't want to spoil them, but there is plenty of them that are absolutely incredible. Like, I think of Cazador in Act 3, which I don't think that's a spoiler to say, but hopefully it's not, so apologies if it is. But there's a lot of really interesting design and the different ways you can tackle those encounters. And verticality is absolutely a big factor in both of these games, especially in Baldur's Gate 3. So combat here, this is the closest category, I think. Like, I think there's elements of DOS2's combat system that I absolutely prefer. There's elements of Baldur's Gate 3's combat system that I prefer. I think we'll go with DOS2 here. So yeah, we'll go with DOS2 just to give Divinity Original Sin a little bit of a leg up. World design is next, and starting with Divinity Original Sin 2. Again, I would say as a whole, the world design in Divinity Original Sin 2 is good, but it's not great. I personally didn't vibe with Fort Joy that much as like a starting area. I felt that it was a little small and restrictive, and that's partly because they're trying to put in all of those CRPG systems and mechanics, like to access the different areas and the ways you get access to them, whether it's via dialogue options or lockpicking or passing certain checks, etc. And I found it to be a bit of a restrictive area in terms of its size and struggling to vibe with the overall location. It wasn't really until Reaper's Coast and you get into the second act, actually I think it's technically the third act, but the second area, what I mean, of the game, it felt to me that that's when the game really opens up once you get to that second act and you see these different environments from, the sandy, deserty area, you've got the graveyard, plus the city little area and like the forest and obviously the scorched area up in the north. But there's a lot of diversity in terms of its environment as well as the questing in this area. And I found that that part of the game really pushed it into a new sphere for me and made me think about the game differently and connect with its environment a little bit more, because it becomes a bit more open and freeing in that the way you can sort of explore at your own pace, do quests at your own pace, and hasn't got that sort of restriction that comes from Fort Joy, which does make sense narratively because you are technically in prison, but it's that freeing aspect I definitely vibed with in Act 2. And sort of beyond that point, the areas become a little bit more controlled as you sort of push the story further, and it's not as expansive as potentially what Act 3 in Baldur's Gate 3 with Baldur's Gate, the actual city Baldur's Gate is, but there is still that Act 2 I remember very fondly for Divinity Original Sin 2. Baldur's Gate 3, interestingly here, Act 1 conversely is actually incredible. It's sort of one of the best parts about the game, interestingly, is that first act that I've probably played 100 hours of just Act 1 in Baldur's Gate 3 across all of the early access, but we touched on this a little bit earlier in the terms of the different locations when we were talking about, the graphical fidelity and the different ways that Baldur's Gate 3 interacts with that, and how you've got these different looks to these locations. I love the way that Baldur's Gate 3 takes, you've got those beautiful open sort of foresty and very colorful areas of Act 1, and then you can go into the oversaturated Underdark if you so choose. But once you get into Act 2, you're in those Shadow Curse lands, which has a completely different color palette and sort of tone and thematically to what Act 1 is. And then you sort of come out the other side of that sort of darkness into Act 3 when you hit the Baldur's Gate city itself. And I really like the way that they play with the colors and the world structure itself. One thing about the Baldur's Gate city itself, because that is sort of part of the world really, is I didn't really like that once you get to Baldur's Gate, the city itself, it's filled with just general fodder, people that aren't really doing anything, which makes sense, right? It's a city, but there's a huge chunk of them, I would say probably like 50% of them that are named. And when you see a named character, right, you instinctively want to go and talk to them, because it's just sort of video game language, is that if someone has a name, they've got something to say to you, and you walk over there and they'll just give you like a one line of something, like not necessarily something interesting, and you're just like, oh, okay. And that happens too much in Act 3. Like, fair enough, some characters might be named and they'll just have a couple of lines here and there, but I felt like every time I come across someone in Act 3 in the city Baldur's Gate, I was like, oh, this person's got a name, and I'll run over there and talk to them. They're like, oh, how about that latest Gazette? Hey, it sounds like you guys are the heroes. And we're like, yep, we're the heroes. And then you just move on. There's I would like that either they weren't named and you could just click on them and they would state the same sort of a thing, or there'd be more to that. It's just that video game language. I think that things that have names, you should you try to communicate with them, and then it's just a little disappointing when they don't have those outcomes. But overall, the world structure in Baldur's Gate 3 is fantastic, and I believe it is the winner of this category as well. At this point, we would typically do a recap of where the point system is at. We've got Baldur's Gate 3 on 3, and we've got Divinity Original Sin 2 on 1. So moving on to the last category here, and that is progression. Now, I always like to rank progression separately because I think it's a core aspect of these sort of games. Now, in Divinity Original Sin 2 here, the progression system is, I mean, it's clearly inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, right? Even from the character creation in terms of the way that some of the classes, or they're not even necessarily classes because you can do whatever you like in DOS2, but these archetypes are basically named after D&D classes. But then even the stat system and the way that that clearly, very closely reflects a D&D sort of a system. Something about Divinity Original Sin 2 and removing that restriction of a D&D style setup is that you have the freedom here to add and remove and change things as you sort of see fit, right? And I think Divinity Original Sin 2 and Larian have done an excellent job of having progression systems that are freeing in how you can sort of decide to build out your character. As you level up, you pick different attributes which then benefit your kit, and then you can choose different combat abilities to, say, specialize in certain type of weaponry or different like magical skills. And then even on top of that, you know, you've got your actual, like, I guess in terms of D&D or Baldur's Gate, they're right, your skills like bartering and lucky charm, persuasion, and talents to really specialize your character even more sort of beyond that point. You've got the freedom there to develop something that's really unique and that's really deep in its own way, and in a different way to Baldur's Gate 3, which we'll touch on a little bit. But even on top of that, the gear itself is, I love gear. Like I love finding new gear, legendaries, epics, etc. It's like my favorite thing to do in video games is when you stumble across like a really cool piece of gear. There's something about that dopamine hit when you find new gear, and removing that D&D restriction allows you to have a bit more gear and a bit more gear in depth that can do different things, like add different effects in terms of, you know, adding percentages to different skills or something like that. And they do a little bit of that in Baldur's Gate 3. I think, you know, we'll switch to Baldur's Gate 3 here. I think starting with that aspect of finding gear, there is plenty of gear and really cool gear in Baldur's Gate 3, don't get me wrong, but there is an element of that restriction because it's trying to stick to a D&D. So you can't have gear that just gives you like a straight armor value, right? Or you can't have gear that's going to increase your stats to some sort of nth degree or add different elements or skills overall to the kit. And I think that they've done a really good job of finding that balance in Baldur's Gate 3 of having new gear that is interesting and unique in its own way. But I just feel that there are certain elements that make it a little bit more restrictive when you're comparing it directly to Larian's own game, where they can just, you know, add gear that can do whatever the hell they like. And in terms of the progression system in Baldur's Gate 3, it is in another way a little bit more restrictive as well because of the D&D leveling up system, in that each level in D&D is very unique and feels meaningful, where in other games, especially in video games, each level is obviously part of its progression system, but you don't typically finish at level 12 in video games, right? It's at least, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50, or sometimes, you know, there's no level cap, because in video games, that leveling system is part of its progression, and it's part of that, you know, dopamine hit, that carrot on a stick, whereas in D&D, obviously it's related to that, but it's a little bit different in that each level up feels like a significant moment for your character in Dungeons & Dragons, and trying to replicate that in a video game setting is a little different, but I think Larian has done a good job of striking that balance for that. But it's just something to think about, I guess, is that those levels don't come as fast, so those sort of dopamine hits, I keep saying dopamine, but it is honestly why we level up in video games, right? Like it's part of that, it comes a little bit later and doesn't come as often in Baldur's Gate 3. Right, I'm rambling now, but I think Divinity Original Sin 2 may take this category as well because of how much I prefer that system, but both systems are fine. There's nothing wrong with Baldur's Gate 3. So let's talk about the verdict here. Now, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, but Baldur's Gate 3 really is Larian Studios' like magnum opus. It's their defining moment. Everything that they've learned from Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2 and the other Divinity games that they've worked on, you can see the learnings of a studio that's taken time to create something truly special here. You know, they've learned from their previous mistakes. They've learned from things that fans may not have connected with in previous titles, and that's sort of part of that early access period as well. But you can see where they've taken their CRPG setups and systems. And I think Baldur's Gate 3 might be the best role-playing game that we've ever actually seen, and not like RPG, right? Like a video game RPG RPG. I'm talking about like a role-playing game where you actually play a role. Now, it's an incredible feat here for the writing, the storytelling, the choice and consequences that are in this game, that you can create a character of any class, race, etc., and you can just decide that this is the role you're going to play, and the game allows you to live in that aspect and make decisions based around that. It's not just like a role-playing game in that you can make good choices or you can make bad choices. It's not a role-playing game in that you're leveling up and making skill choices here, right? Like all of that is included in this game, but on top of that, the depth of the choice and consequence here is something that I don't know if we'll see in a very long time. It's one of those games that's going to go into the pantheon of video games, that this game is like a must play for anyone that's new or returning to games to sort of understand the art form and why it's different to other forms of media. This is something that you would point them to and to show why interactive entertainment like this is something special. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, guys. Thank you for watching this long video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.